Good evening. This is the second and last historical sketch on Sacco and Vanzetti. In the first episode, we reached the point when Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, along with several anarchists, left the US for Mexico. And why did they leave for Mexico? Because in 1917, America had decided to enter World War I against Germany and Austria, though Germany was no enemy at all. And the anarchists were opposed to compulsory registration and were vehemently, of course, opposed to war. For them, registration violated the 13th Amendment that prohibits involuntary servitude. Furthermore, their master and inspirer, Luigi Galleani, whom we met in the first episode, had written in the fiery article in Cronaca Sovversiva titled Matricolati, which means in Italian drafted, urging his readers not to register. You can imagine how well this message went with the police, who arrested Galleani. But there was also another reason why the anarchists went to Mexico. News of the Russian 1917 revolution had just reached America, and they naively believed that they could go back to Italy, to Europe, where the revolution would no doubt spread, and they would join it and make it succeed. Along with Sacco and Vanzetti, the anarchists counted quite a few members from Romagna, which through history has been the hotbed of the most notorious hotheads in Italy, in Italian history, including perhaps the most well-known, Benito Mussolini. In fact, when communism was popular in Italy, Emilia and Romagna were all under communist administration. Still, the revolution remained confined to Russia, and Sacco and Vanzetti and the other anarchists had returned to America. Sacco found a job in a shoe factory, which was his skill, but he quit after a few months when he was required to buy a Liberty bond. "I don't believe in Liberty bond," he said. "I don't allow anyone to tell me how to spend my wages." The United States entry in the war was followed by a period of repression of civil liberties, a period unprecedented in the nation. In 1917, the President Wilson signed the Espionage Act, which set penalties of up to 20 years in prison for those who interfered with the draft or encouraged disloyalty to the armed forces. It is the same Espionage Act used today to condemn whistleblowers, by the way. Then there was also the Sedition Act, with extended penalties against anyone who obstructed the sale of Liberty bonds. Now, mere criticism of the government and of its war policies was cause for arrest and imprisonment. And among the imprisoned and condemned to 10 years was the legendary socialist leader Eugene Debs for making an anti-war speech in Ohio. If the government was harsh with socialists, we can imagine how it was for anarchists. Scores were arrested, and matters took a turn for the worse. The anarchists called for action, meaning armed resistance. The leader, Galleani, had already published, years before, a booklet on how to make bombs. However, in transcribing the formula, he made a mistake, and this proved deadly and costly for some anarchists who had tried the formula themselves. So much so that in one of the issues of his subversive Chronicle newspaper, he warned his readers about the error in the formula of the nitroglycerin and corrected it. Among other factors influenced the anarchists was the Ludlow massacre in Ludlow, Colorado, where the government militia had attacked a tent colony of striking miners, killing 5 miners and a boy, and then the soldiers poured oil on the tents, setting them on fire, and 11 children and 2 women were burned alive, and later 3 prisoners, including a leader of the strikes, were savagely beaten and then murdered. This happened in 1914, but the memory of the event was not yet lost. What occurred is what we call today an asymmetrical war. On one side, the anarchists with homemade bombs, and the authorities on the other with all the power of the military, the police, and the judiciary. And this is important, for in the end, Sacco and Vanzetti were tried for a crime they did not commit. It was the government's physical revenge against anarchism in general. One of the first anarchist conflicts occurred at a loyalty rally in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, held by a pastor of the Italian Evangelical Church. At the end of the pastor's speech, members of the anarchist club rushed to the platform and tore down the American flag. The police moved in and opened fire. 3 members of the anarchist club were killed, and of course this prompted a desire for revenge. One night in November, a bomb was placed in the basement of the pastor's church, the one who had organized the loyalty rally. But the bomb was discovered by the cleaning woman. It was removed and brought to the police headquarters. It was very roughly made, and detectives were joking about this while handling it. Suddenly the bomb went off, and 10 detectives were killed. The authorities then tried 11 members of the anarchist club in Milwaukee, though there was no evidence of their involvement, and condemned them to 25 years in prison. In reprisal for the treatment of their comrades in the Milwaukee trial, the anarchists plotted another act of revenge. However, the plot was foiled when a young Italian girl called Ella, who had been assigned to bring a suitcase full of dynamite to Chicago, was discovered on a train. She was arrested and charged with transportation of explosive, but they could not prove that she was an anarchist. In fact, apparently, she did not even know the content of the suitcase. Still, the discovery of the suitcase with the dynamite and the obvious suspicion of a plot reawakened the interest of the police and of the FBI in the newspaper of Galliani, Subversive Chronicle, and so the site of the newspaper was raided, and the FBI managed to reconstruct the list of the subscribers from the labels waiting to be applied to the newspapers to be mailed out. The police got more than 3,000 names and addresses, and this is where, for the first time, we find Sacco and Vanzetti among the persons of interest. This happened on February 22 of 1918. Now, the police started a wave of preventive arrests. The first to be arrested was the manager-accountant of the newspaper, a 23-year-old Italian accountant who had been driven to anarchism after having read Kropotkin's Memories of a Revolutionist. This young man, called Raffaele Schiavina, lectured extensively in Massachusetts and the neighboring states on a topic such as the American plutocracy, the struggle for existence, who are the anarchists, and what do they want. The agent who arrested Schiavina found him a clever, fluent speaker, an incorrigible, self-confessed anarchist who has no use for any country. And in the context of the probably accurate description of the anarchist Schiavina, as I said, by the policeman, let me refer again to a point I made in the previous episode dedicated to Sacco and Vanzetti. Anarchism was strong in Europe and was fought against with equal discipline and solicitude, if you like, by the police in various countries. An Italian anarchist had killed the King of Italy, Humbert I, in 1900. Earlier on, another Italian anarchist had made an attempt on the life of French Emperor Napoleon III, just to name 2 episodes. So there was plenty of anarchical things to do, so to speak, in Europe without the need and the inconvenience of a costly transatlantic trip to America. By the way, anarchists were self-financed and had no sponsors. Few, if any, had any high-paying job, and they sacrificed part of their income for the cause. Why then, you may ask, so many immigrants turned to anarchism in America? As I said before, in the early 20th century, sources of information were still limited. America, with its lofty Declaration of Independence, was seen as a mirage, with its Statue of Liberty carrying the inscription, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," etc. America appeared from a distance to be as close as humanly possible to an egalitarian society as there could be on Earth. It was a disillusionment, quickly observed and perceived on arrival. The horrible life lived in the famous, or rather infamous, tenements in New York and other large cities. It was this disillusionment that fired the anarchists' anger. And it wasn't only anarchists who saw and appraised the appalling living conditions. And here is a short extract from a very interesting book written by a New Yorker, Jacob Riis, at the beginning of the 20th century, the title being How the Other Half Lives. A man stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 14th Street, looking gloomily at the carriages that rolled by, carrying the wealth and fashion of the avenues to and from the big stores downtown. He was poor and hungry and ragged. This thought was in his mind. They, behind their well-fed teams, have no thought for the morrow. They know hunger only by name and ride down to spend in an hour's of shopping what would keep me and my little ones from want for a whole year. There rose up before him the picture of those little ones crying for bread around the cold and cheerless hearth. Then he sprang into the throng and slashed about him with a knife, blindly seeking to kill, to revenge. The man was arrested, of course, and locked up. Today he is probably in a madhouse, forgotten, and the carriages roll by to and from the big stores with their gay throng of shoppers. The world forgets easily, too easily, what it does not like to remember. Nevertheless, the man and his life has a mission. They spoke in a very ignorant and impatient way the same warning that some of the most conservative government bodies had sounded a little time before. Our only fear is that reform may come in a burst of public indignation, destructive to property and to good morals. The man with the knife represented one solution of the problem of ignorant poverty versus ignorant wealth that has come down to us unsolved. The shout of the masses against the classes, the solution of violence. So, as you can see, the problem was known. What the anarchists did was to frame it in terms of masses against classes. But the authorities, the governing body, opted to see in the anarchists only the element of violence. And Theodore Roosevelt, the new president, said in Congress, "Our immigration laws are unsatisfactory. We should aim to exclude absolutely all persons who are known to be believers in anarchistic principles or members of anarchistic societies." So even subscribing to the subversive chronicle was deemed good ground for deportation. Therefore, starting in 1919, began what came to be called the deportations delirium. World War I had ended in 1918, but the patriotic wartime propaganda that had been used to whip up hatred for the Germans could quickly be converted into peacetime hatred of radicals, especially alien radicals. Wrote the New York Times World, "The U.S. is to be swept clean of these alien anarchists and troublemakers." Furthermore, the anarchist scare blended and combined with the now called Red Scare, brought about by the Russian Revolution of 1917. And the anarchist movement could not, however, be easily eradicated. Not all anarchists were so bold or brash to be visible to the police. Bombs were sent through the mail to authorities believed to be more right-wing than others. 4 anarchists attempted to place a bomb at the American Woolen Company in Franklin, Massachusetts, whose workers were on strike. The bomb exploded, prematurely killing all 4 anarchists. As I said before, the formula was not very accurate. And this was one of the problems. Given the almost amateurish nature of the movement, the anarchists' operational skills were poor, to say the least. Consequently, often they died or were maimed during the preparation of the bombs, or the wrong targets died, which of course defeated the purpose. But each of these acts increased the anti-radical fervor, and at a May Day celebration in Cleveland, Ohio, a detective shot dead a man just for carrying a red flag. 40 other demonstrators were wounded, 100 106 demonstrators were arrested and charged with inciting rebellion. The most spectacular of the anarchist bombing occurred in Washington in June 1919 at the house of Attorney General Palmer, one of the staunchest advocates of mass deportation of suspects. And Palmer himself had a narrow escape. Late in the evening, he and his wife heard a thump at the door, followed by a tremendous explosion. The entire house trembled, its frame was destroyed, and all the windows were blown in. Up and down the block, houses shook and windows shattered from the blast. A congressman from Texas was struck by flying debris, and Palmer himself, the target, was showered with broken glass. Immediately the police searched the areas in an attempt to find the perpetrator. However, it was only some time later, by finding bits and pieces of a body, that they discovered that the terrorist had blown himself up with the bomb itself, an unwilling suicide bomber. Overall, it was an unequal struggle of the weak against the strong. And yet, despite their insignificant forces, the anarchists could still strike damaging blows, and strong enough to put the government on the defense. And let us ban all illusion. Almost all governments represent the interest of a very restricted class. For the anarchist, the use of violence was no crime. It was a justifiable response to the persecution and to the violence of the government. They considered themselves at war with the forces of government and of capitalism. And if the anarchists used bombs, the government itself used bombs for the purposes of war. So it was an even situation, they thought. Capitalism, particularly as they saw it, was a gigantic system of banditry and killing. And by comparison, again, they thought, the violence they used in their actions was or seemed trivial. A few innocent people might suffer, but in wartime this was unavoidable. And violence was one of the few weapons at their disposal, a means of self-defense. And as Vanzetti said, "I would give my blood to prevent the shedding of blood, but neither the abyss, nor the earth, nor the heavens have a law which condemns self-defense." And certainly, by its repressive and often illegal actions, the government was creating the conditions for armed retaliation. Again, quoting Vanzetti, "We fight for a cause, not to be crushed by the keepers. We will never win without vanquishing them. They are mercenary, we are idealists. Should a free man or a rebel allow them to do to him what they like?" As mentioned, the anarchist movement blended with the so-called Red Scare. The name was not coined in vain. The conditions that evolved in the 1920s in America and reached a climax with the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression were scary for the country elites. And you may remember that President Franklin Roosevelt said that with his reforms, with his New Deal, he had saved capitalism. In other words, the so-called Red Scare was a real scare. To be scared for sure were not the ordinary citizens or the striking workers or the inhabitants of the tenements or of the ghettos. And as much as anointed history or official history tries to deny it, concessions such as the Social Security and the program of government investment to create jobs was the direct result of the Red Scare. Red Scare means red fear, and it is a sobering reality that after all is said and all is done, power will only yield to fear. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested in 1920 and accused to have held up a truck that carried the payroll of a Massachusetts company, during which hold-up, the driver and the paymaster were killed. It would be tedious to follow the trial, whose outcome was determined at the beginning. It was a kangaroo trial, much as it was, recently, the trial of Chelsea Manning, for whom some congressmen and politicians, you may recall, even called for the death sentence. American writer Upton Sinclair visited Vanzetti in jail, and in his documentary book called Boston, he says, Vanzetti was a wise and gentle working-class philosopher. He was one of the kindest person I ever knew, and I thought of him as incapable of murder as I was. Sinclair, whose research on the circumstances of the alleged murders was very thorough, concluded that the execution of Vanzetti was the most shocking crime that was committed in American history since the assassination of Lincoln. The worldwide rage at the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti was unprecedented and probably still unequaled in scope and fury. An enormous mass attended their funeral. Violent demonstrations swept through many cities, and the next day, including Geneva, London, Paris, Amsterdam, Tokyo, and even Johannesburg. In South America, wildcat strikes closed factories. 3 people died in Germany. Perhaps we can close this second and last episode on Sacco and Vanzetti by asking ourselves if and when anarchism ended. Some will say that anarchism has morphed into terrorism, but that would be an incorrect hypothesis, at least in my opinion, particularly since several notorious and cataclysmic terrorist acts smell of false flag, that is, of having been carried out from the inside. And this applies, for example, to the assassination of President Kennedy, to 9/11 and others. For whenever the results of an investigation are not disclosed due to national security, we may be reasonably sure that the security to be maintained is not the nation's, but possibly the security of those who planned, instigated, or executed the crimes. Anarchism still exists, but it has turned inward. It is the reverse mirror image of the current neoliberal philosophy, the supreme philosophy of the self. Remember, the anarchists of the Sacco and Vanzetti type did not fight the established authorities for themselves, for the self-benefit of the anarchists. They fought for an idea of equality, however unrealistic it might have been. Today, with globalization and the organized or claimed disappearance of the working class, who or what is there left to be fighting for? No one, or rather, only the self is left to be fighting for. For the very essence of current neoliberal philosophy, Shakespeareanly speaking, is to never be at heart's ease while one beholds a greater than oneself, be it greater among men or nations. And that is the inherent characteristics of the neoliberal label. All other propaganda about freedom, democracy, etc. is frankly poppycock. And this is dramatically shown, for example, in the now customary mass shootings, which occur so frequently that public opinion at large is no longer shocked. At each mass shooting, people either call for gun control or for massive investments in mental care. And if general medicine is already a racket, you can imagine what increased mental care would be. Anarchism for a noble cause of equality has transformed itself into anarchism for the narcissistic desperation of feeling nobody, of feeling no one, of feeling ignored, meaningless, pointless, valueless, wasted. Valueless unless redeemed by an insane and criminal act where the death of innocent others will bring media presence and therefore a kind of media glory. Glory to the perpetrator. That is, death in exchange for glory. But in a sort of twisted and I almost sure unconscious way, the mass shooters imitate the government. For administrations, especially recent administrations, operate under the philosophy that they must be cruel only to be kind. Consequently, as Shakespeare would say, bad begins and worse is left behind, except that there has not been one instance where what started as bad did not continue as bad and ended as worse. Just think of the countries razed to the ground with millions killed, plus drone mass killings, torture made legal, massive incarceration of the poor, climate change, the environment going to pots, and the list could continue. No one I know has a solution for these problems. But the contrast between the narcissistic anarchists of today with the anarchism in whose name Sacco and Vanzetti were assassinated should give food for thought for those who take an active interest in the workings of the world where, to quote Shakespeare again, it is the time's plague when madmen lead the blind. Thank you for watching. Thank you, the crew, and Kat Iverson, our director. And until next time, I'm Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Good night.